Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Movement Economies. I am Steve Dubb, Senior Editor of Economic Justice here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation.
And I'm Rithika Murthy, Economic Justice Editor at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, on land historically stewarded by the Lenape people. How do people not only develop a vision of a democratic economy rooted in values of solidarity, but come together to make that vision a collective reality? To address this question and discuss their contributions, four authors from NPQ's Summer Economic Justice magazine issue, Movement Economies, Making Our Collective Vision a Reality, will explore the concept of movement economies and how movements can be effective systemic economic change agents. Today, our expert panelists are Devarian Baldwin, Paul E. Rather, Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and author of In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. Ade Romero Briones, Vice President of Research and Policy and Director of the Native Agricultural and Food Systems Initiative at the First Nations Development Institute. Johanna Bozua, Executive Director of the Climate and Community Project, a network that seeks to draw on expert climate research and work at the intersection of economic, racial, and climate justice policy. And Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party, a leading movement theorist in the field, and a highly respected organizer and leader within the Movement for Black Lives Network. Before we get started, we have a few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. We'll start with a few questions of our own, and then we'll get to yours. Please enter your questions into the questions box at the bottom of your screen, and we will share as many of them as we can. Second, we will share the recording of this webinar for free online, probably sometime next week. Please also join the conversation via social media with our hashtag #RebuildTheEconomy, and visit the NPQ website for past webinars in the series. One last thing before we get started, please complete the brief survey after the webinar. It helps us inform our work and continue to offer you programming that you want to see. So let's get started. I'm going to pass it back to Steve.
Thanks, Rithika. And I'm going to pass the baton to Devarian Baldwin. And Devarian, can you talk about yourself, your movement work, and your article in the Movement Economies issue?
Thanks a lot. Sorry about that. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see everybody. Welcome to everybody in Zoom land. Thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. My name is Devarian Baldwin. I teach at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, where I'm also founding director of the Smart Cities Lab. The lab has originally been kind of an academic enterprise of information sharing, but during the summer of 2020 and right before that, it became an advocacy arm for community groups all across the country who are struggling to build out equitable lives with their universities, their medical centers, and their nonprofits more broadly in their cities. So that is kind of where I'm coming from. And my broader academic commitments are, grounded in fighting in global cities and fighting for global cities, and particularly the diverse and marginalized communities that struggle to maintain sustainable lives in cities and urban locales. What we used to call the right to the city movement, because it brings together so many issues that we're facing today around housing, land rights, anti-displacement campaigns, labor organizing, and policing. And so my article for this discussion was grounded in the activism against the exploitation and plunder that is triggered by higher education's property tax exempt status particularly. So in the article, I begged the question, who benefits from land controlled by wealthy nonprofits? What I call the knowledge economy's broad ecosystem and the vision and strategies that community groups and social movements have devised to reorganize this political economic regime in response. So that's kind of what I do and what I'm about. Thank you.
Thank you. Ade, could you talk about yourself, your movement work, and the your piece in the Nonprofit Quarterly magazine issue? Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. And it's an honor to be here with you all. Goetzi se hopa, hin weka nime esat watyats kutitime osuta. My name is Ade, and I am Cochiti and Kiowa, and I'm calling in from Chochenyo Ohlone Homelands, which is in Oakland, but I'm usually in Lodi, California. And when I was asked to do this, I'm honored. I'm not a person who usually talks about economies because I feel like I grew up in a very different kind of economy. I grew up in Cochiti, and things operate a little differently there. I would have been totally happy just living, breathing in Cochiti with my own people, practicing our own values and systems. But as I grew older, indigenous communities are some of the communities right in our backyards that are subject to extraction. And whether that be water, whether that be land, whether that be natural resources. And so my delve into economies was really in a response to the pressures on my own community. And so my article in the MPQ magazine was really about partially my own timeline, like how do we learn about economies and how did I center myself to understand the concepts that are now placing a lot of pressures on my own community. So when we look at economies and we learn about economies, we all learn from stories, whether that be from the people surrounding us, whether that be from our educational institutions. And I focused on looking at the stories of indigenous communities and how that affects our positioning in the world, and ultimately how we manage not only the life around us, but between people and between communities. And really, when we're talking about economies, I feel like, especially in my community, there's very few of us who can like actually place ourselves in the American economy without feeling some sort of injustice. And where does that come from? And really, like, there's a lack of acknowledgement for stories, and the stories really position and teach us how to see the world. And really, that's what my article was about. And really, the strength and life and effectiveness of our economies really depends on how people see themselves in that economy. And so the stories are critically important to me, and indigenous people come with stories that are well grounded in time, which I feel like our economies do not place enough value on. And it changes the entire equation when you look at time frames, which is often negated in American capitalist economies. But I can't wait to talk more, and I'm so honored to be on a panel with such brilliant minds who know so much about economy in general. So I appreciate it. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. And, I really appreciate how you talked about our economies as opposed to the economy. So that was a really powerful article. I'm going to pass it to Johanna Pasua, and if you can talk about the interview you did along with Daniel Aldana Cohen and Rithika and I, and your movement work and sort of what were the main themes you were hoping to communicate.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thanks to everyone on this call and for allowing me to join and be a part of this conversation. Yes, I work a lot on kind of climate justice, and really my background has actually originated from fighting against fossil fuels, and then through that process, started to ask, okay, and what are we building next? What as we are eliminating fossil fuels, as we are stopping them, how do we ensure that we are not integrating an extractive economy and extractive system again in whatever comes next, especially in the realities of the climate crisis and the realities that we are already feeling them. And so Steve and Rithika, myself and Daniel had a wide-ranging conversation about like what is the future of the climate movement, how is it changing and shifting right now, and we really covered everything from looking at what Mayor Michelle Wu is doing in Boston in terms of fare-free buses and how that's actually attached to a version of like a a climate economy that actually works for people, all the way up to like, how should we be handling sovereign debt in the Caribbean? So of course, that's a huge range of geographies and scales, but I think kind of the piece that tied those things together was really about the fact that the climate crisis and the green transition right now are upon us. And the question still remains, who will be cared for and who will benefit from that transition? And I think that was a lot of where our conversation came from. And, we've been in this moment now of actually like shifting terrain within the climate movement because of this switch actually probably 5 to 7 years ago in terms of narrative on climate from austerity and molecules to something that's about investment and communities, in part catalyzed by the Green New Deal, but also from years and decades of people who have been fighting for that narrative. And then when COVID hit, it really was this moment of recognizing these interstitched relationships between economic justice, climate justice, public health, right? And offered this opportunity for big investments in climate. And so we're now in the aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act being passed. And with that came a lot of conversations, fights in those final moments to make this the biggest climate policy in the United States and investment ever pass. But what the question often, especially from environmental justice organizers, was at what cost? Because there were things like quid pro quos for renewable energy for fossil fuels, right, that are still integrated into that bill. And so a lot of what's happened now is thinking alongside from like the local to the international context of what do we do next? How do we now organize in this new political terrain with the fissures that exist right now within our movement and rebuild and restitch so that we can handle what has been given to us through the Inflation Reduction Act, and in fact direct the fight in the way that we're getting what we actually deserve next. So thank you all for allowing us to have that conversation, and really excited to dig in more with this incredible suite of people who I see here.
Thank you, Johanna. And I guess last but not least, I'll pass the baton to Mo Mitchell. Before I do, I just want to recognize that Rithika was part of the editing team of that article you wrote on resilient organizations. So wanted to give a shout out to my colleague and talk about the interview you did with both of us as well, and what themes you were trying to emphasize, and introduce yourself and your movement work. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Maurice Mitchell. I'm the National Director of the Working Families Party. And I think the way that I engage this conversation about the economy is from my experience and informed by my experience as an organizer. I've organized most of my life as a youth organizer and a student organizer, and eventually on the local level, working with people, mainly working class and poor, people of color, to build power and for people to be acquainted with their power. And I've mainly worked on the project of political power. And what I've discovered through my work is that it's not helpful, nor is it an accurate representation of the power that we have, by siloing our strategies, where there's like a political power strategy here, there's an economic power strategy someplace else, there's a conversation around narrative elsewhere, that we're talking about racial justice someplace else. People live multifaceted lives, and so we should be having a conversation about political power and economic power and racial justice and gender justice. It just makes sense, right? Like my mother, for example, is an immigrant from the Caribbean. My grandmother came here as a domestic worker. Her experience as a domestic worker from the Caribbean, and then my mother's experience as a nurse who's a 1199 union member, wrapped in that experience is race, class, gender, our conversations around organized labor, our issues around the economy between the 1960s and 70s and 80s. We need to have these conversations together. You know, the other thing I'll say is that I was in a room with New School economist Derek Hamilton, and he asked a provocative question. It's a very simple question. What is the point of an economy, right? And I think we should all ask those questions. I think that the realm of economics seemed really hard for working people to penetrate, just like the realm of politics. And everything I do is try to sort of demystify politics for people. We need to demystify economics for people, right? You know, there are people who think that an economy is the GDP of a country, or what's happening with the S&P 500, or that's a perspective on the economy, right? But I have values centered on our collective ability to build power together, to show up for one another, to make meaning together. That means a lot to me and my politics. And what would it look like if we had an economy based on that, an economy based on our both individual and collective ability to be able to realize our potential, our ability to be able to experience joy and happiness and connection. What would it look like if those were where we centered our values instead of sort of, you know, these ideas like shareholder supremacy, you know, these ideas that we don't even think about sometimes, but are very particular ideas and values, and also very particular political decisions and policy decisions that seem to frame the economy so far. What would it look like? And I do think like we're in this moment where we have an opportunity to shift, where the sort of 40 plus years of neoliberalism are beginning to be questioned, you know, not just from the left, but from the center and the right. Our president is openly challenging some of the logic of neoliberalism. So that to me suggests that there's an opening for a new logic. And who will decide what that new logic is? Who will decide what the values that center a new economy look like? I think it could be us. And so a lot of the conversation that we had in that interview kind of centered on the idea that we could be building a regenerative economy centered on our values. But if we're going to do that, we're going to have to use all the tools. We're going to have to use our political and electoral tools. We're going to have to use have an economic strategy. We're going to have to kind of have an all-in strategy if we want to seize this moment when it seems like people are really trying to reimagine what an economy could look like.
Thanks so much. I think I want to pass it to Rithika to ask the first question of all of you.
Thanks, Steve. So our first question, and feel free, whoever wants to answer first to jump in, is pretty simple, or it seems simple on its face, but maybe not. We published a whole magazine issue on it. What do you mean by movement economies? What do we mean by this sort of concept that all of these different pieces and interviews explored?
I'll go first. Why not?
Sure.
I first just, you know, I think that what's really important, at least for me in having this discussion, was the recognition that we always have movement economies. It's just a matter of which movements are driving them. So right now, if we want to name it, it's the movement of the finance and developer class that are driving the economy. But in naming that, we can also articulate that there are other approaches to social movements that can drive how we envision, coordinate, distribute, make sense of economic systems. So having said that, I do believe and I do confirm like a movement economy, my vision is, you know, economic systems rooted in social movements that I understand, that have an understanding about controlling the means of production, a decommodification of all life and living, the idea of deploying economic resources from the bottom up, from below, community-driven, however you want to call it, versus profit-driven, the idea of democratically discussed and needs-based versus privatized and expert-based, more explicit progressive tax rates. I mean, many of us probably already know that, you know, all the way up to the 1980s, our highest tax rate was at 70%, you know, for the wealthiest. So things like that, worker-run and controlled shop floors, what some people call syndicalism in the past, through collective bargaining, tenant-controlled housing, community land trusts, consumer cooperatives. But the funny thing is that a lot of these things we already have. But the reason why they are not as effective is because they're not grounded or shaped by a broader political system of people's control over wealth accumulation and distribution. And that's the problem, is that you have cooperatives. We have cooperatives for the wealthy, especially in New York City. And so the point is, are these frameworks, are these approaches to redistributive wealth and economic transformation, are they grounded in a broader political system of people's control over wages, wealth, and living? So that's what my vision, and just in the 2 minutes I had, that's my vision of a movement economy that's different from the current movement economy that we're currently living in and enduring. So, thanks.
Just jumping in there, Devarian, absolutely, like 100% agree. And, especially as someone who often is coming from the climate frame, it's like incredibly frustrating that so much of the conversation has been focused on like the fact that we don't have the money in order to invest in like a livable future, when like the reality is, as Devarian was just saying, like the means of production, so much of this is held. We have money. It's just that it is so inherently unequal and inequitable that we aren't able to take care of like one of the biggest crises that's deepening all of the other crises around it. And I think when it comes to this question of like movement economy and building off of you, Devarian, is like, how do we also get there? What's the economy of folks who we are building political power with? And as an organization, Climate Community Project, we work with a lot of academics and researchers who are within these nonprofit behemoth institutions that Devarian speaks so neatly about in his piece. Like they're in these like basically for-profit nonprofits, and how do we like pull them, like these or people who have so much knowledge, to fight for those policy changes, to fight alongside mass movements, the movement building, the political party building that Maurice is doing, and build from, as Ade was describing, these economies that do exist, that are outside of what, we think of and conceptualize as the SMPs, as Maurice said. And so I've been thinking a lot about like, okay, what is the ecosystem or economy that we're building between unions, between mass movements, between researchers, between the wonks that we're trying to mobilize and folks we're trying to get into office? How does that actually build that collective power so that we can seize that means of production back and implement and expand dramatically the community land trusts that are out there, like this concept of what it means to be building the new economy of the future?
The only thing I would add, because I wouldn't change a word of what was said before me, but the importance of thinking about democracy, right? There's a popular conversation around democracy that is really, really narrow. It's primarily a conversation about voting, right? But democracy fundamentally is a value about ensuring that people have a meaningful engagement on the decisions that impact their lives. And the decisions that impact your life exist on so many levels. In fact, most of the time we spend, for a lot of us, is like at work, right? And so what does it look like if most of the time you spend, most of the meaningful engagement that you're not spending with your family is at work, but you don't have a say as to anything that happens at work, right? For us, that is a huge blind spot in terms of actually building a democratic society, right? And of course, like at the Working Families Party, we engage in all these strategies in order to make sure that people could vote. But that's one particular activity, one tactic, and one day. But 365 days a year, how are we engaging in a democratic process where we have a democratic society and a democratic economy? And what are all the various tools to make that happen? And how is there a coherent understanding of, and a North Star of what a truly sort of broad-based democracy would look like? And we think if all we're doing is offering people some political choice, but then as it relates to a democratic economy, we're either silent or we're putting up all these barriers so that everyday working people can't participate democratically in their economy, and not just simply participating as a consumer, but really participating in all the ways that one could participate in an economy through, you know, actually owning owning the means of production, actually like making decisions if it's a business on how profit is shared or what is done with profit, making decisions about working conditions and being fundamentally involved in all those ways. We think that when that happens, what I've seen as an organizer is like when people shift from agent to subject, something transformative happens to them. So we actually think we'll be in a very, very, very different society if people are engaged democratically in their economy. It will actually change how we relate to one another. And so we're not just talking about the material benefit, although that's a big piece, right? We want people that have more, right? We're actually talking about how people relate to the power that they have and how they could collectively be able to leverage that power.
I love everything that was said before me. When this question came up, like I struggled with it because movement and economies are two very heavy concepts, and not everybody comes to the conversation having the same understanding of what either of those words mean. And for me, I've never considered myself part of a movement. I'm Coach Tia and Kiowa. I have done what my people have always done, which is like try to steward our lands, try to feed our people, and try to take care of our children. That is like the base of my existence. And that in itself doesn't end. It doesn't start somewhere. It started way before me, and it doesn't end with me. And so when I think about a movement, there's an assumption that the movement started at some point and the movement will end at some point. But my existence is not dependent on anything external. But I become labeled a movement the moment I start challenging dominant institutions that are putting pressure on my community. And when that happens, like I am part of a movement, but I'm labeled by someone externally, by not necessarily by my own community. And when we talk about economies, we're really talking about our relationship to place first and foremost. But if you have a dominant institution that's not rooted to a specific place and runs under the assumption that we all operate the same, that we all operate and have, like, I challenge everybody because I think we're all part of separate economies, that we're all part of economies, whether that be in our homes, whether that be in our communities, whether that be in our local economies. And like those values and structures are just as important as the national conversation. And so like when we talk about movement economies, like we really have to be grounded in our positioning. As I said in our introduction, like how is this conversation being positioned and who is creating these labels? Because it changes the conversation. I'm honored to be standing with many Indigenous people who are fighting against extraction for Indigenous communities, but it's usually not by choice. Usually it's by necessity. And when we talk about movement economies, sometimes it's not a choice. Like many of our communities are struggling. Many of our people, like Mo said, like the idea of agency is constantly being challenged. And there are so many people in this country who don't consider themselves part of the national economy. And we rarely acknowledge them. We rarely acknowledge that they're practicing economies and values much differently than we can verbalize. Like the verbiage we give to our children and how we articulate how we exist in this world is critically important. And if they're not using verbiage like the GDP of my local economy or the profit and margins, like those are very very unique language and verbiage that supports a very specific kind of economy. And so one of my reactions to this question was like, okay, it kind of forces us to talk about a particular kind of economy, when really I think we all exist in economies that we're fighting for in one way or another, or trying to support in our homes, in the way we talk to each other, and in our communities.
Thank you so much, Ade. All of your sort of preliminary responses lead us really well into the promises and challenges of our second question, which is, what does an intersectional approach to economic justice require? What lessons can be drawn on from historical experience, and sort of, even in the present now, how are we thinking about intersectionality today?
I can jump in first. I was just thinking about this question a lot in terms of what brings us together. And one of the things that actually came first of mind was this bill that passed in Pennsylvania last year that was called the Whole Homes Repair. And we actually wrote about this for NPQ in our kind of Green New Deal, climate policy you can touch series. That was about how the bill is called Whole Homes Repair, and basically what it does is it provides people with access to retrofitting to lower their bills on a daily basis. And Climate Community Project researchers looked and found that if you're looking at energy poverty in the state of Pennsylvania, the places where you see the highest energy poverty are in, the city center, in the city, largely where majority Black neighborhoods are located, and then in the rural areas of Pennsylvania. And I think there's a really interesting story to be told there, because we see those two communities as they're often pitted against one another, seen as not holding the same, needs, wants, or fighting for the same things. But the reality is, when you're looking at some of this stuff, they are experiencing energy poverty. They both are feeling this question of will I be able to have my heat on at the end of this day, on this cold day in Pennsylvania? Or will I be able to have AC when we have higher heat days than we've ever seen in the United States, right? And so there are just these opportunities to bring those folks together and have that intersectional approach, rural meeting urban, and fighting for the same policies. And actually, part of that, the fact that they were able to bring together that coalition of people was in part of the reason why that bill was able to pass. And now that it's been in implementation, it was immediately oversubscribed, because people had both fought for it and then saw that it could be implemented. And so I think that there are just real clear ways for us to interstitch our shared needs and wants, and push back against where we have been divided by class, by capital in so many ways, as a way to do that power building that's necessary to fight for what we all deserve and need.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll try to respond to this question. Well, I think there's some through lines in terms of approach, right? I think the way that we, in a very practical way, we emerge at something that we could call a intersectional sort of organizing approach, or intersectional way to look at our economies, a way to actually build as movements, is I think it starts with a lot of curiosity. And I think it also starts with a posture where we're not drawing too many assumptions, and recognizing that there's all different types of diversity. Some of them might be very, very visible and clear and obvious, and others might not be so obvious. And you might miss some of those things if you take shortcuts. And so that choosing to remain curious, I think, helps us actually visibilize all of the diversity that might exist in a room, or in a space, or in a coalition. And then, concretely, I think of the work that we did. This is another climate. We were part of a broad coalition effort called the Green New Deal Network that included climate justice organizations that have been on the front lines of the fight to challenge extractive economies, from indigenous communities to Black and Brown communities to rural communities, larger environmental organizations that have been involved in like the broad fight for an environment that we all could steward, labor institutions, grassroots organizations that aren't considered climate organizations, and then organizations like ours that work primarily on electoral politics. We all came together because we understood the stakes were really high. We understood that there was an opportunity to pass major climate legislation. And also we understood that the details mattered, and that depending on your emphasis, you could really lean into sort of like a green capital strategy, or you could lean into a strategy that considered the concept that the people who had been most hurt by climate crises, generally working people, generally people of color, they should be at the forefront of the solutions. And if there are going to be significant investments, there should be real measures and guardrails to ensure that those investments go to those people and those workers. And other conversations that happen because we decided to engage in, and it isn't perfect, it isn't easy, but engage in what I like to call strong solidarity versus like a weaker sort of solidarity, right? I think you could build a weaker solidarity if you only focus on the things that all of our similarities, right? And if you kind of like hide our differences or hide the tensions or contradictions. And then what happens is you get going, and then as soon as a contradiction emerges, your coalition falls apart, right? And falls apart on all of these axes: race, class, gender, et cetera, et cetera. But if you actually front load the hard conversations and talk about those differences, then you're able to build a stronger solidarity. And the outcome is an intersectional practice that includes these nuances where people could actually see themselves. And then when you actually are ready to execute, this is, I think, speaks to the example before. People from different identities, from different localities, from different experiences own a economic practice, or own a organizing practice, or own a strategy or a campaign, and are willing to fight for it. And when we win, are willing to hold the line and protect it. And so I think that, there's a lot of wisdom in that approach, and sometimes going slow so that you could go fast. And it requires the ability to listen, to be curious, to not take for granted any priors, and actually try to build a practice that's based on all the experiences in a room.
For me, intersectionality, you have to, I put my historian hat on, you have to go back to the roots for me. And of course, this varies from person to person, but I think about, intellectual activists like Claudia Jones and people like Ella Baker, who thought through, what we call intersectionality, or what, Claudia Jones called triple oppression, as a way to think about how, just more broadly, how we don't live our lives in discrete areas. We live them all at the same time, different experiences in the same body. So for her, it was race, class, and gender. And then at the same time, when her Claudia Jones' radical ideas became so powerful that as a Caribbean immigrant, she was exported. She was, sent away from the U.S., right? So that's another part of her anti-colonial critique. It might be considered a fourth part that we would incorporate today. Or Ella Baker and her notions of group-centered leadership, moving away from a charismatic approach to leadership. So it's these Black women and her amazing piece, and I think it was in The Nation, The Bronx Slave Market, that crystallized the way in which a series of experiences converged on this one condition. So these kinds of examples, to me, I carry forward in my own work around nonprofits, and particularly universities and places like New Haven, Connecticut, when I was asked to join with people like, New Haven Rising, particularly in an intersectional way, because Yale as the company, as the company in New Haven, as the company town, had been able to remain so powerful, not because of their brilliance, but because they had been able to maintain isolation between various parts of existence. Housing campaigns were here, labor campaigns were here, policing campaigns were here, sustainability campaigns were there. what New Haven Rising did was it brought together these issues around housing, labor, sustainability, land, gender justice, sexual violence, policing, through the lens of the one institution that had a hand in all these things, Yale University. And so, pairing with the work that I do and looking at the kind of economic, materialist ecosystem of the meds and the eds, higher education and medical facilities, this allowed us to crystallize and map together how what had been presented as the discrete areas of existence and struggle were actually rooted and routed through each other. And so offering that broader mapping gave us a powerful way of offense, a comprehensive vision to counteract or to respond to the ways in which people actually live their lives. Having a campaign this way that was comprehensive, as someone mentioned earlier, allowed people to see themselves in the campaign, not in isolated ways, but in comprehensive ways that reflected their daily existence, that they live labor struggles and evictions and issues around food deserts, all in the same being. So this is, for me, taking intersectionality into a different place. And at every turn, who they find there pulling levers, it was Yale. And so this intersectional approach allowed us to turn the lens backwards and create a different vision of what was called earlier a democratic vision of justice and a democratic understanding of an economic framework, a different economic landscape that was embedded within the way people lived as compared to the way they theorized. So that's my sense of this intersectionality in this.
+2 or like 2000, whatever, like that was beautiful. I just add a few more thoughts here. The question, like intersectional approaches to economic justice, and I'm going to struggle through this, but I'm just going to go through, yes, so forgive me, audience, I'm going to struggle through this and try to articulate myself as well as possible. When I wrote my article, I wrote about, and I started with a creation story, which was about like the world was dark and then Sky Woman came, and I started with that story purposefully because the darkness is part of the story. And when I think about economic justice, to me, there has to be a common threat that brings people together. And Mo, you said curiosity. I would actually like say it's probably threat. There has to be like a sense of threat. People have to see pressure or see something that's putting pressure in any kind of way on different sections or different people, so that they can respond accordingly. But you have to be able to see the threat. When I grew up in the desert. My husband is from Hawaii. When we go fishing, I couldn't see the fish. Like I would look in the ocean and for the life of me, I couldn't see it until he said, like, just look for colors of purple. And once I started seeing the colors of purple, I saw thousands of fish. And so there's two things to me, like in intersectional approaches to economic justice. One, there has to be a sense of a common threat that creates like coalitions that feels much bigger than one person or one community that brings you together. And two, you have to have enough people in that community to recognize it as a threat. Sometimes our educational institutions create processes and curriculums that teach our children and our people to be complacent in the system that we are presented with. We have to have enough people who can see the threat and be able to question those institutions to create these larger institutions. And I think about some of the most powerful institutions in Indigenous communities, like the All Indian Pueblo Governors Council. It came because they were trying to tax Indigenous lands. The state was trying to tax Indigenous lands. We didn't always get along, but that was our common threat. I think of the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois Confederacy. Colonization was the threat. They didn't always get along. And some of the most important values and practices that these coalitions face is like after the threat was over, they had enough relationship and they institutionalized some of those relationships so that they would last beyond the threat, and so that they actually had like an up on response to the next threat. And so to me, like, when we get to the point where we feel like our economy is enough of a threat to all of our communities, like I feel like there'll be a massive response. Indigenous communities, people of color communities have felt this threat for a very long time. And I'm both happy but also disheartened that it's taken so long for these voices to be heard in response to the dominant economy that we are in today.
Thanks for all those powerful answers. I'm going to try to combine a couple questions because I want to get to the audience questions, and thank you everyone for your questions. So I was struck by Mo's comment about creating subjects and moving from what was it, agents to subjects, something like that. And so what crises are your communities experiencing, and what are some responses that they're engaging in community economic building today? Maybe give like an example so we can make it a little bit concrete. And I know you all know of examples, so I don't know who wants to jump in first, but anybody can take this from here, and then we'll get to the audience questions.
I can jump in with an example that we're thinking a lot about right now, and I'm thinking about because it's September right now, which is back to school month for a lot of kids across the country, right? And one of the things that's been happening, we have a inherently racist public school system in the United States there, and like deep disinvestment in public schools as well. That is, of course, like falling across racial and economic lines. And then layer in the climate crisis. Right now, it's one of the hottest months, like September's on record. So many schools, actually, there are lots of schools that couldn't start because it was too hot in classrooms to actually be able to teach. And teachers are trying to help students like deal with this new reality of like not having an HVAC system so that they can actually like get AC in these super old hot classrooms. How are we supposed to learn and teach and be with one another when we are handling these kind of extreme heat measures? And so right now, actually next week, there is a growing coalition of folks who are thinking about what does a Green New Deal for public schools look like? What does it mean to take on racial justice, climate justice, economic justice, student justice, all at the same time, and bring in union workers through all of that? And so Climate Community Project has been working with a really incredible group of like union teachers. Let's talk about one of the places where we are just seeing incredible radicalism right now, and folks who are thinking about how they can, as we say, bargain for the common good. UTLA took this on very clearly in their last contract campaign, saying that they were fighting not only for themselves and their wages, but also and their working conditions, but the conditions of their students. And they included climate as one of the things that they were fighting for alongside their communities. And so there's this vision for a Green New Deal for public schools. And next week, Jamal Bowman will be reintroducing this bill. It's actually the Green New Deal bill that has had the most, co-signers of all the Green New bills that are out there. So there is this want and need and interest in fighting for that. And it's been really incredible over the past few months to see students talking with teachers and then talking with parents as well to build this political coalition that wants to fight for this, not only just at the federal level alongside, our great, progressive leaders like Jamal Bowman, but at like going in where the right has already fought so hard in things like school boards and say, no, we're reclaiming this and we're going to fight for a livable future. So I think that's been a really exciting thing to see, like from from, you know, where we are right now with schools and what we could be building and the vision that those coalitions are already starting to set out.
I'll just say that I really appreciate you raising up the UTLA struggle, because it really resonates with me and kind of the work that I find really hopeful and inspiring from an intersectional perspective, actually, you know. So I would just say, just real quickly as a preempt, like most of my work focuses on campuses, both, you know, tech campuses, university campuses, medical campuses, as a site of struggle, not because I want to live in isolation, but because they have become the central political economic fulcrum of urban economies. Right? They consolidate and converge. A number of issues we're talking about converge on these campuses, and yet they're hiding in plain sight. So I just want to be clear about why my struggle, my interests lie largely there, not singularly, but largely. If you want to understand these like macro level economics interests, a lot of them converge on these campuses, not as academic study, but as a route of procuring and consolidating wealth and power. And so with that being said, a lot of things that I've seen have been really powerful and inspiring, including reparations campaigns in Georgetown and Evanston, which is a weaker one, California right now. I've been talking to people in New Haven and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Baltimore, and Ithaca about pilots, what we call payments in lieu of taxes, because cities' budgets are struggling, because universities and medical schools are the biggest property owners in their towns, and yet they don't pay property taxes. So pilots are a modest attempt to redistribute some of that wealth. You mentioned the bargaining for the common good. So I've been organizing with labor unions at Rutgers campus, and also as a member of the National American Association of University Professors, trying to push them a little bit to the left with my vision of the new shop floor, which is driven by the work that I did in New Haven and other places, saying that, you know, if we're going to do labor organizing, we have to go beyond simply wages and work conditions and tenure, because these very same workers are not just faculty, they're groundskeepers and cafeteria workers, and they're graduate students. And so we have to combine and they live in these cities, these new company towns. And so if we're going to organize, we have to do what I call organizing around the new shop floor, which aligns perfectly with my comrades in the bargaining for the common good. And we work together all the time. Also, the pushing for inclusionary zoning in West Philadelphia, as Penn and Drexel run roughshod over what used to be the Black Bottom neighborhood with their med tech campuses in University City. That's another important campaign. And of course, the campus police divest invest campaigns that includes Cops Off Campus and other organizations, recognizing that in the summer 2020, we're talking about police power. Many of our cities and towns, both rural and urban, the biggest police presence in their communities were campus police, not municipal police. And so with that being said, if there was any policing institution or any institution that could engage in divest invest, shifting power away from carceral and militarized approaches to food security, housing security, trauma care, if any institution could do that transition, it's campuses. So why aren't we engaging in campus abolition, particularly through campus police? So these are just some of the things I've seen and I've been a part of. Simple things like the low-hanging fruit of food security. University campus cafeterias throw away food every day. What would it mean just simply to, and I said this in many Zoom calls and many convenings, to simply just take that food and repackage it into healthy meals for communities of need? One medical student at UPenn, Cooper Penner, took me up on this, and he, with no help from the university, got together with the local DSA and worked with largely Black women, immigrant women in the cafeterias, volunteering to put together this food into healthy meals for communities of need throughout West Philadelphia. So these are just a few of the campaigns and visions and strategies that I've either witnessed or been a part of that bring together, that match the comprehensive power of meds and eds in our cities and rural areas, and meets it with organizing power through a sober analysis of how the economy works in their daily lives. So I'll stop there.
That's amazing. Does anybody else want to jump into that, or should we go to audience questions now?
Well, I'll quickly raise two campaigns that we're involved in. One successful campaign that we engaged in the city of Chicago, where we supported United Working Families, which is our local partner the Chicago Teachers Union, SEIU, and other folks across the movement in electing Brandon Johnson to be the mayor of the city of Chicago. That, sometimes we talk about our politics from the standpoint of individuals and individual political actors and personalities. So the conversation around Brandon's election is often centered on him, but he's an organizer who is also a union member, part of a very, very powerful, very progressive union that is mainly led and whose rank and file is predominantly Black women. And years ago, when he wasn't an elected official, he was part of a deliberate strategy that started with a strike years and years ago that ended with a mayor who is now leveraging the power of the mayor's office to develop a more collaborative relationship with a movement where we're talking about a perspective around investment in people versus investment in capital and corporations. That basically was what the campaign was about. And with every issue, the difference between him and his opponent was this question around who is at the center of our government, who's at the center of our economy. Questions around public safety, right? There was a invest in policing, invest in more police. And then there was the invest in our communities, invest in our young people, invest in jobs. And that was popularly understood by people, all types of people in Chicago, that was the right approach. And now Brandon is more than 100 days into this experiment of trying to execute that. The second thing is in Atlanta, the Stop Cop City campaign, which is now turned into an electoral campaign where we're trying to get on the ballot, and Working Families is very, very much involved in that process. And it includes a broad base of various folks in community, folks who are concerned about the questions of indigenous sovereignty, environmentalists, folks in the Black community concerned with public safety, folks who are interested in leveraging this as an opportunity to draw a light on the fact that the city somehow has tens and tens of millions of dollars to build a separate city just in order to practice policing, but they can't actually invest those resources in the actual city, right? And so these are opportunities, I think, where we're able to figure out how to use the tactic of elections to be able to talk about much bigger conversations and to build coalitions that ultimately have us all popularly question where we should land our investments, what do we value, and how do we approach all of these issues and our challenges? How do we actually create safer communities? Is it by investing in more and more police, or is it by actually investing in our people? It's a policy choice. It's an economics choice. It's a values choice. These campaigns allow us to have that conversation by showing that contrast.
Okay, great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we're going to turn to some of the questions from the audience, if that works for everyone here, just because they mirror a bit what we were going to ask next anyway. So we were going to ask, and someone in the chat has also asked, what kind of coalitions need to come together to advance this kind of change? How do the people in this webinar, for example, practice solidarity with those efforts? And someone just asked a question, which is, how do we engage people who can't see past having to decide between buying food to eat or buying gas to get to work, which I think are all sort of related, right? What are the ways that these coalitions can come together, and then how do they get bigger, stronger, and then also more engaged and supported by people in, the racialized working class? So feel free to answer that broadly, any of those questions.
I'll give an example of one of the ways we practice solidarity at First Nations. And I'll also answer the last question kind of in response to this question too, because I think they're interrelated. One of the major crises that I think we're all facing is the character of land ownership in America. Like when we have a certain demographic and a certain class like owning the majority of land in America, there is like supports that will continually like cycle themselves so that certain communities are supported. And I think that's a crisis. And one of the ways that we practice solidarity at First Nations is we participate in a fund called the People's Land Fund. And the People's Land Fund is a group, is Indigenous groups, it's Black communities, it's immigrant communities, it's young farmers, people who do not own land. And the sole purpose of this group is to find ways to transition land ownership to people who have historically not owned land. And that's a very simplistic description of what we do. But if you think about who owns land and how you own land in America, it's a very complex bureaucratic process. And I am a lawyer, but I think it's extremely complex. And there are so many biases in the system that it becomes really hard for people who don't have like capital to own land. And so one of the ways we do that is People's Land Fund creates the infrastructure necessary, and the infrastructure is different for every community. Like some communities have infrastructure, some don't, some have institutions, some don't, some have capital, some don't. And all of those things require like conversations and building of infrastructure together. And hopefully, and we're very young, so probably 2-3 years, once we like start building this infrastructure, it can be used by others. But that's one example that I'll leave here.
Anyone else want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah. Highlight a couple of campaigns and how I came to know about them is that we talk about solidarity, being able to be open to allies and possibilities at various scales. So many times in movement communities, we're very suspicious of, say like, and rightfully so, of like philanthropists, for example. But then you have an amazing organization like the Margaret Casey Foundation, and some of the things, and them being extremely self-conscious about the limits of philanthropy in the past, and the fact that, we have philanthropy because of the consolidation of wealth at the top that is so high that these people can write off gifts in a feudal way at the behest of their largesse. Like that's the nature of the kind of philanthropic economy. But within that framework, so then how can we, like they're doing right now, initiate a campaign called Public Dollars for the Public Good, and support, sponsor, and create coalitions with on-the-ground campaigns like the KC Tennis Union or the Solidarity Budget Campaign in Seattle. And so what they've done with this Public Dollars campaign is they put together these on-the-ground groups like KC Tennis Union or Seattle Solidarity Budget with people like myself, offering research, evidence, strategies to try to figure out ways to grow and build and expand what they're already doing, or just simply to support what they're already doing. And so what I'm learning, by working with these organizations is that, when you start with something like, okay, the powerful statement on the part of the KC Tennis Union is that what the labor union was for the 20th century, the tennis union can be for the 21st century. This brings everyone together, that even those who own homes are renting them from the banks, right? So this piercing analysis that is about the site of struggle, then all those that converge around it, that are touched by it, regardless of their social position, their identity, et cetera, they of course will come at it different ways. They have different points of access. They have different relationships to that common struggle, but they can converge in it. Is so much more powerful than just simply saying, which we have on the left, some of the, the Yimby bros and some of the Bernie bros as well, talking about a colorless left, the idea that race or gender splits the left, and that they're divisive categories. Instead of coming at it that way, but coming at it with issue-based and acknowledging that people have different scales of belonging to these issues and these conditions, for me, is a much more robust and revelatory approach to solidarity than trying to find some fictive, homogeneous base, and not engaging with the texture of how people engage with economic conditions, with lived realities. That's what I found.
Anybody else want to comment on this question, or should we go to the next one? Okay, I'm going to do something.
So
yeah. I'm going to go to do something similar to what Rithika did, and combine a couple questions. So there's a couple questions that actually falls a bit on what Deverian was just talking about in terms of narrative. So one of the questions asks, in considering what Maurice Mitchell called demystifying the economy, what small changes in media could we look to? And a leading question, for example, does reporting the stock market normalize a wealthy perspective? And then there's also a sort of a negative question about how do you counter, the discourse, sort of the anti-woke discourse is the way that, I would put the person's question. How do you message so that, that counter program that, I guess, is the best way of thinking about it. So anybody want to address narrative change in terms of economics?
I do think that there's an opportunity to engage, because the reality is most working people, like around the world, are in a world that is rapidly changing and feel some level of insecurity, physical insecurity, economic insecurity, and are honestly trying to make meaning of this world, trying to make meaning of these changes, trying to make some sense of this feeling of physical or economic security that they surely are feeling. And I think that's one of the reasons why populist movements have been so successful in organizing working people, because they're providing narratives that help make some meaning of what's going on and help tell at least a either partially or fully true story about how we might have gotten here. I think the right-wing populists are accurately providing some, not accurately, but at least accurate in their assessment that something is actually going on that is structural. And there are a set of elites who have aggregated more power than they know what to do with, and they might be behind some of those things. But then they tell a story that often involves an other that is to blame, right? And they tell a story that leads people into nationalism, ethno-nationalism. We could tell a different story. We have an opportunity to tell a different story that says, yes, you should believe your eyes and ears. Something is wrong. The fact that you're feeling insecure, the fact that you're trying to grasp for meaning in this time, the fact that a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense, like, yeah, you should believe that. And yes, the fact that you have an inkling that there might be people, elites, corporations, individuals that got us in this position, you're right, right? They've been given the ball and they've driven us to crisis after crisis after crisis, right? But what would it look like if we took the ball, if everyday people took the ball? We've been, since we were born, we were told that we should look up to these people, to the elites. What would it look like in a world where we looked towards one another, right? And what possibly could happen if we did that? What solutions might be behind us looking towards one another, right? I think if we engage in a conversation like that, then we could interrupt some of these some of these really simple and trite anti-woke, pro-woke narratives that I don't think really serve us. Because the reality is most people, whatever their identities might be, are wrestling with these questions around basic dignity, around being able to protect themselves and their family, around being able to participate in the economy in a way that makes them feel safe. And most people don't feel safe. And it's been a huge recruiter for the right wing, and it can be a huge recruiter for our cause, but it's going to require us to engage with people where they're at, and not take the bait, because I think the Fox News business model is based on the fact that we live in a binary tribal world where there's the woke mob and the freedom lovers, where there's latte sipping progressives and real Americans. And we need to challenge that whole paradigm, the whole binary paradigm. And I agree that people lead complex lives, and people have all types of ideologically incoherent beliefs because folks are trying to figure out this very complicated world and trying to make ends meet and trying to get between pickup and drop off and their second job, and being inundated by all of these messages. That's why labor unions were so helpful, to help make people make meaning of moments, right? That's why organizations are so helpful, in order to help people make meaning of a very isolating and alienating world. So I think that we need to challenge a lot of these binaries that only serve the business model of the 24-hour news channels, and talk about the world that we actually live in, which is complex, which has a lot of gray area, which is often incoherent based on these like left, right, progressive, conservative binaries. That's where most working people live.
Thanks.
Can I
Johanna? Yeah. Oh, Ade, go ahead. Yeah.
And I'll keep my comment very short. In addition to what Marie said, one of the things that I constantly get agitated by, just because once you recognize it, you will always recognize it, is that in all of these conversations, there are underlying assumptions. And one of the underlying assumption is that we have leaders, and it's like a heroism complex, and it's very much embedded in our American structures and systems, and the way we tell stories, and the way we idolize people, the way our children are brought up. Like, the leader of the pack is the hero, and we constantly reinforce this. And so that leaves like a whole lot of other people out of the value system that we like idolize. And so part of our job as people who start to recognize that this is a value that we need to challenge every time it faces, and it's all around us, is that the hero syndrome is hurting us. Like, we are not paying attention to the people in our community who are not considered leaders, who are not considered valuable because they don't get good grades, or they don't have a good job, and like, part of our responsibility as being part of a community is like recognizing those people are there, and recognizing that we have a stake in what happens to them. But what happens is, like, first, it's hard for us to sometimes see ourselves part of a community. Second, it's hard for us to see ourselves part of a community that may have people who need help. And then third, we kind of like put our blinders on because like we're listening to leaders, and all of those go to support a system in which a whole lot of people are not part of the conversation. And we should be constantly like putting our feelers out to make sure that we're aware of people in our community, whether they're struggling, whether they are articulate. I mean, like Mo and most of the panelists said before, is like, diversity of experience and thought is critically important to making sure that we have healthy economies, functioning economies. And so like, challenge the heroism syndrome that's constantly fed to us by so many streams, not only like in the way we tell stories, but in the way we listen to the news, the way we talk to each other, is like that it's hurting us. It's hurting all of us.
Thanks. Well, let me try to do one more audience question, and I'll pass it to Rithika to close out this. So this I thought was an interesting question of what lessons can we learn from the ongoing pandemic and sort of the rush to move on. I mean, there was a short period of time, where there was a significant expansion of the social welfare state, and then it's been largely rescinded in the United States. So, 5 million children are now in poverty who weren't last year, for example. So any thoughts on that and what we can take from that experience.
I can start out here and attempt, but I'm sure there are many, many ways to take on this question. And I think we learned a lot from watching how the COVID crisis went down as movements. I think there was a massive amount of organizing that came out of that and won big things and like built infrastructures in communities. And it will take time in some regards to have that mature and be able to collect that reaction to a crisis and fight for like the long-term enduring power that we need in order to not have something like COVID and the reaction happen again. And, you know, I think it was just, it was really incredible to see like actually a huge amount of tenant organizing, as Devarian was mentioning. A lot of it grew out of the climate crisis and it's growing still now. So while, you know, the federal government, while Biden wants to say, yes, that, you know, COVID's over, everyone pull your masks off, everything is okay. And like, we don't need these social services in the same way. I think that there's actually still, even though it was so hard in some ways to build movement infrastructure during COVID, it is enduring and there is like additional power that is being built right now that emerged and was seeded by people realizing that they had to fight for their neighbor. And even some of the stuff like Amazon work, you know, some of the Amazon unionizing, I think, comes out of COVID-19 working conditions and seeing that, oh my gosh, like they are not going to show up for us when that, you know, when this crisis happens. And so, yes, right now, it may not feel like we're seeing those systemic or structural changes in the same way, but I imagine that in the years to come, we are going to continue to see the power that was built by movements, you know, come to fruition and gain the wins that we deserve.
Thanks. So not so easily forgotten after all, huh? Anyone else? If not, Rithika, do you want to close this out?
Sure. So we have a last question that will hopefully end us on a high note. And that question is, what does winning look like? I was just telling the panelists before we got on this call that a lot of good things have happened in the past couple of years. A lot of disappointment has happened for the left in the past 10 years. So what does winning look like and how do we know it when we see it? I'm going to reverse the order in which we introduced ourselves. So Mo, if you could start us off, that would be great.
Thank you. And also let me take this opportunity to thank you, Rithika, and thank you, Steve, and thank MPQ and the staff for having us and for publishing us. So I want to complicate the question, if you don't mind. Okay. So I often think about this, and I've been organizing since I was a young person, and I get this question a lot because we don't always win. Sometimes we suffer some pretty hard defeats. And people ask, well, what allows you to sustain a life in this work and to stay committed to these sometimes seemingly maybe abstract or distant sort of revolutionary ideas or goals or whatever? And for me, it isn't in the winning. In fact, the conditions are 80% of it, and we don't control the conditions, but they often determine whether or not we win or lose. We got a good 20%. That's on us, right? But it really isn't to us whether we win or lose. We do our best, and sometimes we suffer some hard defeats. Sometimes we experience some amazing wins. But the winning and losing isn't for us. And then the moralizing, whether or not this is a morally just thing to do, it's hard to know enough to know if the things that you're doing are the right things. We try to do the right things, but history often determines, history often determines whether or not we were right. And sometimes obsessing about whether or not you're right is more for your ego than for the people that you're in struggle with, right? We try to do our best, but we always are operating with incomplete information. And all decisions have downside and upside. And trade-offs. But the thing that I like to focus on, and the thing that I think we could really lean into, is what are we building together? Who are we choosing to be with, and who are we choosing to be? And we could always return to those questions, win or lose. We could always turn to those questions and turn to one another. And it's like, when I lose, I'm choosing who I want to comfort and who I want to be comforted by. When I win, I'm choosing who I want to celebrate with and who I want to make assessments with, right? That's really what this work to me is about, and getting every day to make those choices about who I'm choosing to be in community with, who I'm choosing to fight with and fight for, win or lose.
Okay, great. I think Ade was next, right?
Gosh, winning for me means clean water, means healthy food for my community. It means that my children will be able to eat the food my grandparents ate. And it means that like my community won't have the external pressures and we can focus on building our community instead of fighting for the existence of our community. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Ade. Very succinctly put. Johanna.
Really hard to go after like Mo and Ade when they've just like given such like beautiful answers. But both of them got me thinking about and kind of amending some of my thoughts in this. And oh, Ade, clean water. Oh my gosh, yes, exactly. It's like I want people to be able to live in their homes and not be afraid of being kicked out of them. Like that's what winning feels like to me, that they feel secure and safe and happy and filled with that community that Mo is talking about. Like that's what winning really feels like. Or like a student going to school and seeing a teacher and another like person that works there and everyone feeling happy, excited, cared for in those spaces. Like that I definitely is winning to me as well. And also, you know, to get to that point that I think Maurice brought up of like, okay, yeah, let's complicate this a little bit. I think we can also win when we lose. And like, let's remember that, right? Like we can get closer than we've ever gotten before and build infrastructures that are going to win us the win on the longer term. And it's okay if we didn't get there the first time. And sometimes that can be hard when working on issues that are so immediate. And we do need to be trying to like change those material realities at that moment. And also how do we care for ourselves and make sure that we are there for those longer haul wins too. And build people up so that when we lose, we don't lose that infrastructure too. So I think they're like, I love this idea of like, what does the world look like when we win? And how does that mobilize us now to like build in, you know, happiness and power together. So thank you both, Steve and Rithika, for having us on to have this great conversation.
Thanks, Johanna. Devarian, I'll let you bring us home, please.
Wow. It's really hard to go behind everybody things that you said. I mean, I just want to say that on a fundamental level, yes, we want clean water. We want quality housing. We want the money that we do give to whatever form of governance we believe in. We want it to work for our families and our communities. Like these are all tangible wins. But at the same time, as was already said so eloquently, far more eloquently than I could state, that no matter whether we win or lose in kind of a quantifiable metrics approach, who are we? Who do we turn to? Who do we believe in? How do we vision the world? How do we see the world? How do we understand love? How do we understand each other? Those things, as I've already been said, are very powerful. And from my history bag, and it's something I've been saying to my students and colleagues for a long time, is that even in this critical moment where we have the so-called woke mob, you know, chomping down in Florida and Texas and Tennessee and other places and North Carolina, their alarmist screeds, they demonstrate that we're winning. The power in which they're trying to mobilize to tell these false narratives shows that we are doing something right and we are a threat and we need to keep on doing it. And so for me, the mounting power of the opposition demonstrates the power of my success and my win. And I hold to that and I thrive on that and I live in that. And I think that's something that we all should think about and at least at some level. You know, again, let's be clear, resilience is not enough, right? Especially for Black and brown folk and women. But there's something to be said about the fact that the degree to which you are opposing me tells me that I'm winning. And we need to build on that. So I'll stop there.
That's very inspiring, Devarian. We all should gain strength from our haters. I completely agree. Steve, I'm going to pass it on to you to conclude. And thank you, all of our participants, so much for coming. This was really wonderful.
Yeah, I just want to add my thanks to the participants. It looks like we lost Ade Leonis from the technology issues at the end, but thank you, Ade. Thank you, Devarian Baldwin. Thank you, Johanna Busua. Thank you, Mo Mitchell. And thanks to all of you in the audience for your excellent questions. We got to as many of them as we could. So thanks for joining this episode of Remaking the Economy. Our contact information is there. These slides will also be sent out by email afterward. And please, if you could, complete the survey after this webinar. That gives us information that helps us plan future programming at NPQ. And lastly, thanks to my co-editor at NPQ, Rithika Ramamurthy. And hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks so much.
And thanks to our web team who are behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Thanks.